Hey there, hikers. Sloth here, and dreamers behind the camera as usual. And today we're doing a little different video. This doesn't have anything to do with the trails or anything. It's more of a incomplete history of the evolution of the backpack. And it's very subjective. It's from my experience and the influences I had over the years. And I can give you a little bit of background about how backpacks have evolved from the 60s on up to present day. When I first got interested in backpacking, I went to the high school library and checked out a book, and it was woefully out of date. It was by a man named Bradford Angier, which he did do an updated book later on, but this was a man back in the 1920s. He was a friend of Colonel Townsend Welland, who was a big researcher of equipment in the U.S. military. Colonel Welland he was a contributor to outdoor magazines like Outdoor Life and Sports Field and things like that. And back in the day, they did a lot more of outdoor camping and a little bit of backpacking, fishing, hiking back in the mountains to go hunting or fishing, things like that. It's a little bit different than what we have today, but that was the origin of some of the modern day backpacking we have today. And in this book, Home in Your Pack by Bradford Angier, Dreamer says it might be Angier. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but he was a woodsman. He probably could have went out with an axe and stayed in the woods for a week and not thought twice about it and survived okay. This was a book that influenced me early. It's a cheap book that you could buy off the rack at the drugstore, and I read it and absorbed it. And he goes back and talks about the packs like I talked about earlier, trapper packs that the trappers would make on the spot when they were carrying out beaver furs and things back to their canoes, and those were real men back in the day. A lot of them were a lot smaller than what I am today. Most people say that I'm average or on the thin side, but I look like a giant beside some of these guys. But they were carrying out loads that were 100 pounds. They would make their packs and then load them up and have what they call tump lines, which was a strap that went around their head. And what they would do, instead of having the weight on their hips, everything was on their shoulders, so they would lean their head forward to take some of the weight off their shoulder blades. And it was not a comfortable thing, but it's what they did to get the job done with the portages between canoe areas. But Bradford Angier, it opened the door for me, and he started talking about more modern packs. He talked about, I've heard various things about how the hip belt became a modern day evolution of the pack. And there's a man named Dick Kelty who's with Kelty Packs, and the history goes that he was walking along one day in his blue jeans, and the frame of his pack worked his way into his back pockets, and he realized that his pants were holding up some of the weight from the pack, and he was able to stand up with his spine more erect rather than leaning forward to take all the weight on his shoulders. And so he started developing hip belts. Now, I've heard other things where other people had co-developed the hip belts and things, but that's one of them, and I believe it was Bradford Angier that I first learned about that. And another influence, and this is more of a generic thing, this was a book you could buy at J.C. Penney's or bookstore, and Backpacker's Digest. As you can see from the cover, these people were wearing full frame packs, and they got on their mountaineering boots and all their heavy gear. That's another thing we'll talk about, is the evolution of the weight of the gear. This was a common sight back in the day. As you can see, they got their bedroll or their mattress at the top of the pack, and sometimes people would carry their tents up there, things like that. And this was a general thing. It's just a compilation of different authors that contributed to all the essentials of backpacking. And then we got the man, Colin Fletcher. Now, Colin Fletcher was an English gentleman who had served in with the elite forces in the British military, and I believe it was World War II. He's an interesting fellow. He went all over after the war was over. He got out of the military. There wasn't a lot of jobs in the UK back then. he went to the colonies in Africa and became a farmer for a while. He got interested in the outdoors and nature, and even though he was a farmer and he bulldozed a lot of roads into the what would be the outback and of Africa, he started to realize that he really enjoyed the nature part of the business, and he became known as a big backpacker. He moved to Canada originally. After he returned to the UK, moved to Canada, and then started getting interested in the outdoors on the West Coast. He's primarily known for camping through California, up along Oregon and Washington, and he's got several books. The Man Who Walked Through Time is his exploits of walking continuously through the Grand Canyon, the first man to do in one trip through the national park of the Grand Canyon below the rim level, which if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon and seen some of those areas, it's quite a feat. This man also hiked from Mexico to the Oregon border through California, and it kind of paralleled what is the Pacific Crest Trail these days. It wasn't a thing to do back in the 50s. But he just felt the urge to do that. It was a calling, and he tells about the equipment he used and the things that he started doing on his own to alter his pack loads and the techniques he developed. And he became so popular back in the 60s that he was kind of part of the countercultural movement, even though he didn't mingle with the hippies and things like that. He was kind of a guru to these people that back to nature, and they started using his word as the Bible. As a matter of fact, one of the reviewers called this the Bible for backpacking, the go-to source for things back in the 60s. Now, he did actually 4 versions of this. There was the initial one that was a good seller. Then he did the second one about 8 years later, and the third one came out, I can't remember if it's the late 70s or early 80s, but this was the biggest seller. And then as he was aging, he co-wrote the 4th edition with a man who was more tech savvy, that had things like the electronic transponders for people to be able to find themselves, or call for help and things like that. But this was his biggest seller, and this is the one that influenced me. Now, going on from that, we have REI Jardine. Now, REI Jardine was another character. He was I believe he worked for NASA. He was an engineer, and he became very interested in mountaineering. He developed an alternative to the spike. A lot of times they would spike into the rock, and this would leave a permanent mark, of course. You're spiking and driving with a hammer, the spikes into the crevices and things like that. He developed something he called a friend. It was a spring device that you put into a crack, it would open up and it would grab. You could attach the rope to it and it was solid, and of course he made a mint off of that, or became comfortable. He stopped working for NASA and became interested in backpacking as well, and he backpacked the Pacific Crest Trail with traditional wear, he and his wife. They both love the outdoors. And then he started experimenting with lightweight gear, and that's what brings us to today. If you've never heard of this man, he had a big influence on the gear of today. I'm sure there were other people that were experimenting with lightweight, minimal gear, but he's the man who did it and documented and shared his knowledge. So you can thank REI Jardine for your pack being lighter today than it was originally back in the Colin Fletcher day, and especially during the Bradford Angier day. Okay, so this was not my first pack, but it's probably the oldest design that I personally own at this point, so I thought I'd start out with this. And like it or not, a lot of people of my generation or older, this may have been the pack that they used in their first backpacking experience, even though it may not have been voluntary. This is an Alice pack. ALICE stands for All-Purpose Lightweight Individual Carrying Equipment, and that the greater ALICE group also included the load-bearing equipment that people used, the pistol belt and the ammo packs and the canteen holder and all that type of thing that you would use when you go into battle on foot. This pack was initiated far after World War II. In the World War II in Korea, a lot of the packs were made of canvas and leather and things like that, and it was determined they did not do well in tropical environments and prone to mildew and out at sea and things like that. So the Army tried to upgrade, and in 1961 they commissioned what they called the tropical nylon rucksack or something to that effect, and that was the kind of the granddaddy of the pack itself. This is not like a lot of packs you see today. And when I was in the Army, which was 40 years ago, we were a mechanized unit, so we did not get the frame. You can use this pack with just the straps, and you can load a lot on there, a lot more than you want to carry. At one point, we were helping a National Guard unit train, and we did not have our armored personnel carrier, so we had to carry everything with this. And for some reason, I got recruited to be the radio operator, which that was not my normal job, but the normal radio operator was a real tiny little dude, and I had to carry a 13-pound radio and 2 extra batteries and all my clothes and my field rations for 3 days in this thing without the frame, and it was not comfortable whatsoever. You had all the weight on your shoulders, and it was pulling your shoulder blades together. And of course, I was a younger man back then. I was 20 years old, or maybe younger than that. I think I was about 20. And even though the pack is almost indestructible, I mean, people threw these in the tracks and the deuce and a halves and sat on them and just threw them around. The pack is actually quite heavy. I've read, and I don't have scales, but from what I've read in my research, the pack with the frame is supposed to weigh 9 pounds. Now, I don't know if they're also counting the ammo bags and the pistol belt and things like that in with that, but this is not a lightweight pack. It is a decent pack if you're just going out for an overnight, going on a hunting trip or something like that. You can make do with it, and they're probably getting more scarce now, but up until through the 80s and all, you could find them at surplus stores and sometimes gun shows and things like that. The frame is not adjustable. The straps are fairly adjustable. The hip belt is not complete. It just goes into the small of your back. Even with the frame, it's not a comfortable hip transferring type situation. So it is what it is, and like I said, a lot of people got their start with a pack like this. Okay, when people hear the name JanSport packs, most people think of a smaller version of this, a simple nylon sack. It's usually green, though they have different colors, and most people used them to carry book bags. Started back in the 80s and carried on through the 2000s, and these days there's all kind of different variations of that. JanSport made a lot of money selling to the college crowd, and then it trickled down to the high school crowd. But they got their start back in '67. There was a gentleman who promised his girlfriend that if she married him, he would name his company after. Her name was Janice, and he named the company JanSport. From what I've heard, these people entered a contest, and it may have been Easton Aluminum or some other aluminum manufacturer that had a contest for people to come up with innovative uses of aluminum. Aluminum's pretty ubiquitous these days, but back then it was aluminum was pretty much related to the aerospace technology and things like that. Well, the gentleman who started JanSport, it was actually 2 gentlemen. It was an outdoor enthusiast and an engineer. They came up with a way, instead of the metal frame, which had become common back in the early days that Colin Fletcher had written about. They knew that aluminum would satisfy the strength requirements and be lighter, and so they won the contest, and they took that money from that and started their company. it also was handy that the girl that was named Janice, that the company was named after, was a seamstress, so she knew a little something about manufacturing the bags. And this was not their earliest type of pack, but it's a typical example. One of the innovations was with the ladder frame packs, which I'll show you shortly, sort of like this. A lot of them were welded, or they had a solid connection at the joints. These joints have a little block here, and they give a little bit of flexibility. So when you're walking down the trail, this frame pack will give with you a little bit. That was a big deal back in the day, and there's a lot of other companies that try to address this and with various degrees of success, and we'll get into that a little later on. But this was a typical JanSport, and I picked this one up at a flea market. Another innovation they had was, up until then, just about every pack loaded from the top. This is what they call a panel loader. You could lay this one out flat and put all your stuff in. I just have a pill in there to fluff it up. But if you needed to access your sleeping bag in the middle of the day and had it at the bottom, you would be able to do that without unloading all your gear. People would zip up the zipper, and a lot of people were worried about the zipper giving way with a heavy load. But how they fixed that was they have these cross straps, and they would go in, so the straps would bear the bulk of the weight, and the zipper was there just to close it. Of course, the drawback with that is it's a little bit less waterproof. Now, when I was a kid, just getting into backpacking, I'd heard about JanSport, and they were on the upper echelon of the pack manufacturers. And I was kind of excited when I bought this at the flea market years and years ago. I was disappointed with it, to be honest with you. It really didn't feel like it lived up to its reputation. Of course, these things don't have a lot of adjustment on them. And it may just have been one that did not fit my torso. I have a bit of an odd torso to fit. But even though it's practical and it's lighter weight than a lot of packs that it competed with back in the day, this was a successful pack, and they went on to manufacture not only packs, but also they originated the dome type tent. I've heard it said that they did not put out a patent on the dome type tent, and a lot of people copied them. They regretted that, but for the stability, the dome type tent with the aluminum poles gave them a lot more stability than some of the lightweight A-frame tents that they used back in the day. Okay, we are now getting into the Sloth Era. Like I said, when I was 14 and first read that Home in Your Pack book, that was the first time I'd ever really heard of the Appalachian Trail. It wasn't as well known back in the day, even though the Appalachian Trail goes right through the county where I live, and I had crossed the trail on that county road a time or two by the time I had read that book. And I remember they said it was 1,995 miles, which I think it was longer than that even then. He just didn't have the mileage right. But I was fascinated by the opportunity that people could take to walk from Georgia to Maine. When I was a kid, there was a TV show on called Daniel Boone, and of course I watched the reruns all the time, even though the show was filmed in California and really didn't reflect what the Appalachians looked like. It always made me wonder about what the Appalachians would have looked like to the first settlers that came through. And I figured the Appalachian Trail was the closest thing that you could get to having that experience, even though a lot of the fauna and flora and everything had also changed. But anyway, after I read the Home in Your Pack book and read the Backpacker's Digest, this is what I could afford on a limited budget. Back in the day, Kmart ruled in this area. This was called a trip pack. They had a trip pack 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I have modified this one. It did not have this little sloppily attached sleeve on the back and these two green pockets on the side. That's something I bought at a outfitting store and sewed myself with through much pain and pricking of fingers. But they're still on after 45 years, so that's good. This pack originally just had the 2 blue pockets and the one sack in the middle, top loading. Padded straps and no hip belt. I knew that was a detriment even back then from what I had read, but it was okay. It was something that I could afford, and I really only used this pack one time during an overnight deer hunt. We just set up out in the woods, and I used this to carry the sleeping bag and a little bit of food and whatever. But I have to admit it's relatively lightweight compared to the packs of its time. It's a aluminum frame. It does not have the lock joints like the JanSport. It's just got an internal, I don't know how they crimped this thing in there, but it's there, and it carried it all the weight that I ever used. And there is a little bit of adjustment for width on here. There's no adjustment for torso length. But for me, at the time, I found it to be adequate. I wasn't but maybe 5'3" or 5'4" at the time when I bought this, but I used it a few times throughout high school. Really, like I said, the only overnight was during that hunting trip. Okay, now the next pack that I purchased when I was in the Army, I bought this at a pawn shop in Killeen, Texas, outside of good old Fort Hood. Some of the guys I hung around with, they decided they wanted to go camping overnight, and I was not about to take my Alice pack that I had. Like I said, back then we didn't have a frame. I picked this up at a pawn shop for about 20 bucks, I think. I knew Himalayan was a name that had a good reputation. Colin Fletcher had mentioned it in some of his earlier books. This is not one of their primo designs, but it was adequate for what I needed. Now, what you can see with this one, it does have a top load. You can take the cords out here, top load here. It's also got a panel load, so if you wanted to, you could put your sleeping bag in this section rather than exposed down here, as was the custom back then. A lot of people would take a stuffed sack, put their sleeping bag in there, and then use straps to hold it there. Some people would do that to the top if they didn't want their sleeping bag to be on the bottom when they set their pack down. It's a lot different than today. This one did have four pockets. This material is Cordura. Now, that Kmart pack I told you about was just a nylon, generic type nylon pack. This was Cordura, which is very, very abrasive resistant. It's very tough. This pack is heavier than the little Kmart pack, but it does have the hip belts. First pack I really had that came with a decent hip belt that wrapped around. It does have some adjustment for torso length here. It's supposed to have the little plastic things here where you can set it at one position. This one, someone had removed that by the time I got it, but I didn't fret about it. The pack straps are not the softest. And a lot of this Cordura, even though it was abrasion resistant, it could put abrasions on your skin if you didn't have that covered up around your waist. If you had a high shirt or a shirt that rode up, this could be a little rough there. If it got under your t-shirt or around your collarbone, this Cordura could really give some abrasion on that. But I used this just a time or two while I was still in the Army. Okay, for several years after I got out of the Army, for some reason I didn't feel inclined to walk in the woods carrying heavy loads around. But eventually I got more interested into the Appalachian Trail, and I decided to upgrade my pack, and I went to the REI store in North Carolina and saw they had this on sale. This is an REI, what they called the Ultra pack at the time. Now this is when packs were really getting heavy. This one probably weighs 6 pounds, and of course it's lighter than the Alice pack, but up till then recreational packs were just used for recreation. Now these packs were bull strong and probably almost as durable as the Alice pack, but this pack did have a hip belt. I have that removed for some reason now. I can't lay my hands on it. It did have the four pockets, it had a top load, and it had a panel pack like the Himalayan did on the back. And I also had an extra pouch up here for like maps or first aid or something you need to get onto. You can see this flap. This is where pack manufacturers start to pay more attention to waterproof qualities of the pack. And of course the pack covers were available at, by this time as well. But no matter what kind of pack cover you had, the water could always get in between the pack itself and your back and run down and get things wet on the inside. That's why a lot of the people would always say, make sure you had plastic bags or your stuff sacks were waterproof on the inside to keep, if the pack itself wasn't dry, then it would keep your sleeping bag and essentials and clothes and things like that dry on the inside of the pack. I used this one on several trips, and I suppose you'll notice just about all the packs that I've used, so far I've had a frame, except for the time when I was in the Army and didn't have the frame for that Alice pack. But now Colin Fletcher, he was an agent of change, especially in this book, the 3rd edition of the Complete Walker. At the time, there were a lot of pack manufacturers that were going to what they call the internal frame, and they did not have that, what you call the ladder external frame like you've seen on most of the packs I have here. Colin Fletcher really gave a boost to the internal frame movement. He had a relationship with Gregory packs, and he described that he had gone from his frame pack that he had used for years and years and years and gone to the Gregory pack because it fit him like a glove. He said that, and he had such influence at that point that it seemed like overnight the internal frames just kind of took over. Now, external frames were still available up through the 80s. You can still get them today, but you kind of have to look for them these days. But Colin Fletcher was the agent of change for the internal frame pack. Alright, then somewhere in the early 90s, this was my first foray into the internal frame pack. There were a couple of big names back then. Gregory was one of them. Like I said, that was one Colin Fletcher had give his endorsement to, and they took off from there. Dana Designs was another one. In the early 90s, there were, on the Appalachian Trail, if people were well-heeled and had the money, they would just about always have a Dana Designs Terraplane. They were known for their suspension that was very comfortable. Gregory, they had their adherents. Gregory's were built very well, but this pack is getting, even though it's an internal frame pack, this thing weighs about 7.5 pounds. Now it's built what they call bomb-proof back in the day. It's got a frame sheet here. A lot of the internal frame packs would have just the aluminum stay that run up through the middle of this, and that's where it transferred the weight from the bag itself onto the hip. But this one has a frame sheet, and it has a pretty solid lumbar pad here. And I actually went to a place in Harrisonburg, Virginia. They told me they had a Dana Designs pack. It was on sale that would fit me. And when I got there the next day, they said, we don't have that pack. So I don't know if somebody at the store had wanted it and found out that it was about to be gone and they claimed it for themselves or what. But this pack was on sale at the time, and they were a Gregory authorized dealer, and they fitted me to it. And I took it out on a trip in Highland County, Virginia, the Laurel Fork area, and I absolutely despise this pack. It didn't matter how I adjusted it, how I adjusted the load. This was the most painful pack I'd ever worn outside of that Alice pack when I was carrying all the radio gear. It may fit somebody else better. The people may have just been wanting to get rid of it, and I said that this one fit me, but I tried it a couple of different times with different ways of packing it, and it didn't make any difference. Now, for somebody that wanted this, I understand these were really packs that were used for expedition level things, like if you're really mountaineering and assaulting one of the high mountains in the Himalayas or Denali or something like that. It does have, this is the first pack I had to have a stand-up collar. You can adjust this top lid, and if you have extra gear like food or ropes or whatever, the collar will come up here and you can still keep this lid on top of it. It's a high volume. It's probably 70 liters or something like that altogether. It does not have any external pockets except for the ones on the top lid. It does have a panel at the bottom where you can put your sleeping bag at the bottom. Let me show you here. A lot of straps on this thing, a lot of attachment points for people that are carrying snowshoes or crampons or skis or whatever. Like I said, this is a bomb-proof pack, and I believe it, but I quickly found this was not the pack for me. Well, I'm sure no one will be surprised that I overlooked a backpack. And while I was talking about the Gregory with the frame sheet in the back, the internal frame pack that I did not like, something reminded me that I did own an internal frame pack before that one. And this is it. This is a Camp Trails. It's called, it's got the Rainier stitched right here. This is a pack I bought for a hunting trip to Colorado, and I intended on getting to know the area where I was hunting and then maybe spend out a night or two in the backcountry. A couple of days after we got there, we got 2 feet of snow, and my plans just changed drastically. So I never actually used this to go out on an overnight trip. This is, like I said, a Camp Trails, and it has the more traditional for the early 90s. It's got these aluminum stays, and what these do, they take the place of the external frame. They run from the top of the pack down to these little sleeves in the hip belt, and that helps transfer the weight of the pack onto the hip belt. It does have adjustable torso length, which is neat. It's got a sort of a unique way it does that. The hip belt is adequately cushioned, and it goes around, covers quite a bit of the hip, so there wasn't any complaints there. And like I said, I never used the pack. It's perfectly serviceable. Camp Trails was a big name back in the early 70s, late 60s. They made packs comparable to a lot of name brand packs back then, but by the 90s they were more of a entry-level pack. Now, even though I never used it, in 93 I believe, I was section hiking the Appalachian Trail, and a hiker that was hiking the trail from Maine to Pearisburg, Virginia, was using this exact pack. And he had used it the year before when he did northbound from Georgia to Pearisburg, and he did not have a bit of trouble with it. He said it was comfortable. Actually, considering it's an internal frame pack, it does allow for quite a bit of ventilation back here, which is sort of unique at the time. The material is not exactly Cordura, but it is heavy nylon. One of the problems with Cordura that I found is it has an odor to it when they use the waterproofing spray to it. They usually waterproof the inside of the packs, and it just had an odor from the beginning of it, and it tended to get a little bit worse over the years. But this one, it's 30 years old, and it doesn't have any of those odors like the normal Cordura does. This one is compartmentalized. It's got a panel loading section here for the sleeping bag, and it's got a top loading here. The top lid here has quite a bit of storage. It is not removable like a lot of more modern packs is. But like I said, this is a Camp Trails. I think when I bought it, it was just about $100 retail, and I think I might have got it a little bit on sale. So this is one I do own, and it's functional, but I've never used it myself for overnight.